Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Gamecore. Today we're going to do a phone review. This is the REDMAGIC 7. Now this is a gaming-centered Android phone, and it has a couple neat features. For example, it has active cooling. There's a fan inside here. And it's going to need it because it uses the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1, which is the most advanced Snapdragon processor, which is notorious for being very hot. And it also has a couple other gamer-friendly features. For example, it doesn't have a notch. The camera is actually hidden in the bezel here on the left. On top of that, the display runs at 165 Hz, which is really nice for a lot of Android games. And it also has two built-in adaptive triggers here on the top. And these work via REDMAGIC's built-in key mapping software, and so you can assign two functions directly to the phone itself. And yes, I know it sounds like a gimmick, but it actually turns out to be pretty handy when you're playing this without a controller. And so yeah, it's pretty crazy. This is probably one of the most powerful Android phones available right now. Now it comes in three different models here, which have varying degrees of RAM as well as internal storage, and they also have different designs to them, as you can see here. And the launch price is going to range between $629 and $800 altogether. Now I'm testing the Supernova one, which comes with 18 gigs of RAM as well as 256 gigs of internal storage. And while all three models have that same chipset and fan, this one's unique because it has a transparent back, and then the fan in the back here is RGB lit as well. Now in this review, I'm going to mostly focus on its gaming performance, both with Android games as well as emulation. And I'll also try out a few phone things as well, just to make sure it's pretty good at phone stuff too. But just to give you a quick summary before we dive into the details, the gaming on this is really good. Android gaming is no problem at all, and the retro game emulation all the way up to PS2 is really impressive as well. For the most part, this phone is at the level where you don't really actually have to mess with settings that much at all. You just throw in your game, turn it on, and it starts to work. But I'm getting ahead of myself now, so let's actually dive into the review. And without any further delay, let's jump into it. Okay, let's start with some specs here. I'm not going to go into crazy detail, but I do want to show what's available. Now, first and foremost, the distinguishing factor of this phone is its chipset. As you can see, it runs 8 different cores, and one of them has a base clock of 3 GHz. On top of that, it has an Adreno A730 GPU core, and up to 18 gigs of LPDDR5 RAM. In terms of display, it has a 6.8-inch AMOLED touchscreen with a 1080 by 2400 resolution and a 20:9 aspect ratio. In terms of connectivity, we have Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.2, and it also has an audio jack, which is always welcome. In terms of battery, it has a 4500 mAh battery inside, and it can do quick charging. In fact, the fan kicks on while it's charging, which makes it stay nice and cool while it's doing the fast charging. In general, I found that I've gotten about 4 hours of gameplay when I'm playing it really intensely, when I'm playing the most arduous games at the highest rates with the fan running. But when it comes to just like everyday use, it feels like a regular old phone, like I just need to charge it up at night when I go to bed. Okay, let's do a quick unboxing here. So REDMAGIC sent me this phone as a review unit. No money was exchanged in any way, all opinions are my own, and they're not seeing this video before I release it. I will leave a product link below, but it won't be an affiliate link. First thing I noticed is the phone actually comes with its own case. It's very thin and lightweight, but it fits the device perfectly. You also get a USB-C cable and then the 65-watt charging brick. Okay, let's take a look at the phone itself. And first impressions here is it feels like a high quality phone. It's not cheap in any way. And second, I really love the fact that it doesn't have a camera notch. I know a lot of people just kind of get used to a camera notch on their phone, but I also appreciate the fact that you don't have to get used to it with this phone here. It also seems to have a very thin screen protector on it. I did not take this off during my review period. On the left side here, you can see the volume buttons, and then above it is one of the air intakes for the fan. And then there's this little red switch. Initially, I thought this was a silence, to turn off your ring, but it turns out this actually switches between game mode and regular mode. We'll show that off later. Not a lot going on up top here. It looks like you have a microphone as well as your antenna band, and then of course a headphone jack. On the opposite side of the phone, the next thing you're going to notice are these two adaptive triggers here. And these sit flush with the phone. They're not physical in any way, but they do have a little bit of grittiness to them. We'll also test these out here in a second. It looks like we also have some sort of mic or sensor here, and then our sleep and wake button, and finally our air exhaust vent. On the bottom we have your speaker, USB-C charging port, and then your SIM card slot. Unfortunately, this does not have SD card storage. Okay, on the back here, the first thing you're going to notice is all the text here. It's a very gamery kind of style. A lot of these are just specs of the phone itself. It does have a triple camera setup, which is just lined up here along the back. And my model has a transparent look to it. I can see a little bit inside the phone, not a lot, but it is kind of cool. And of course that white circle on the top right here is the fan itself. So putting the case on the phone itself, it does provide a measure of protection, but not a lot. And it does tend to make the phone look a little bit more gamery than it did before. And so hopefully we'll have some third-party options here in the future because I'm not a big fan. Now, I'm going to spare you the experience of having to set up an Android phone, but it's exactly like you would expect it to be. This phone, by the way, runs Android 12 out of the box. And so this is what it looks like fully set up. It actually has a fingerprint sensor here inside of the screen, and it works really well. And this is the stock experience here. I haven't changed anything in terms of the background and stuff like that. You can see it has these little widgets. For example, you can turn on the fan and change it between eco mode and then cooling mode. And this is what the fan looks like when it's turned on. As far as I can tell, there's no function to like change the coloring or anything else like that. It's just going to be like this every time. But you know, it is kind of cool looking. It's a bit of a shtick, but at the same time, I do like it. The air flows in from the opposite side of the phone and then pushes out on the other side. In terms of Android phone functions, I'm not really going to get into details here. It's exactly as you would expect it to be. There are some unique features. For example, you can change the fan speed here, and you can also change the screen refresh rate. There are 4 different options here. You can do 60, 90, 120, and 165 Hertz. When you switch it to 165, it is going to give you a warning that it is going to take up more battery life. But yeah, overall, the display is very nice on this phone. I'm a big fan. It's got nice contrast and colors. I'm not a huge fan of the 20:9 aspect ratio, but that's just kind of how phones are nowadays. And you know, thanks to that huge amount of RAM, everything just feels really zippy on this phone. For example, unlocking it with the fingerprint sensor is just super fast. It's almost instant. Now, charging this up is kind of neat. It actually shows you the charge speed in the hundredths of a percentage. And it charges very fast. I would say in under an hour, you can charge this from 0 to 100. On top of that, the fan keeps it nice and cool as you're charging. Now, while we're talking about phone stuff, let's also talk about the cameras. Now, the camera on the back does have image stabilization. This is footage from me walking through a little mini golf course from the other day. And the picture itself's a little bit washed out when you're in direct sunlight here. The camera just can't really figure out that dynamic range very well. But I would say overall, when it comes to just using it as a video camera, it seems to be pretty good. And the image stabilization seems to be solid. Now, the quality of the front-facing camera is not quite as good. It does provide a 1080p image, but it's not quite as sharp. But I think it'll be just fine when it comes to like video chatting, Zoom, and Skype, and things like that. And so yeah, you're not going to be able to film a masterpiece using these cameras here, but it is decent for a gaming phone. Now, in addition to videos, this can obviously do photos as well. Here is at a 1x zoom, and then this is an ultra-wide shot here. And I'd say that does look pretty good. Now, when you get to a 3x zoom, you definitely are going to lose some quality, and then the 5x zoom is just even more washed out. But the 1x zoom seems to be pretty good, and it does have a portrait mode as you see here, so it makes the background a little bit fuzzy. I wouldn't say it's perfect. I think it's very obvious that this is being done via software and not via an actual camera lens. But all the same, the option is there for you. Okay, let's talk about gaming. First thing I want to talk about is that little red switch that I mentioned earlier. Now, when you flip this over, it changes the interface and gives you what they call the game space. And within here, you can navigate all of the different games that are available on your phone. Now, the key distinction here is that it's not going to recognize every single game as being an actual game. And then things like emulators, it won't recognize as being a game at all. And that's important because when you go in here, you can actually change the performance threshold of each of these apps. And so when you change it to what they call the rise setting here, it's going to go into performance mode. And that obviously is going to use up more battery and all that other kind of stuff, but it is going to give you the best performance. And the reason why this is important is because if you have an app that's not registered as a game here in the game space, you won't be able to put it into performance mode at all. For example, if we look at the DuckStation emulator, it's not on the list. Now, a lot of these games and even the emulators are not going to actually need the performance mode. It actually can get by just fine on the regular mode. But some of those hard-hitting emulators are going to need it. For the most part, things like PSP and beyond will do much better in performance mode. Now, once an app is registered as a game, it'll do things like the Game Assist mode, which will allow you to swipe from the right, and then you can pull up all these different menu options here. And within here, you can toggle on the performance mode, change the refresh rate, and they have a bunch of other widgets here that allow you to do gaming-centric things. For example, you can set a timer for yourself if you have like a raid that's scheduled or things like that. But my point in all of this is that all of your emulator apps and some of the games themselves need to be added to the game space here before they'll actually be used as games. For example, if we start up DuckStation, which I did not register as a game in the app, when I try to swipe from the right, it doesn't show anything. This basically just behaves as a regular old app. But if I go back over here and go into the PSP emulator, which I did register as an app, as you can see, it'll start up the Game Assist, and then I can swipe right and then make all of the adjustments here. So long story short is that you'd need to flip on that red switch and then go in and make sure all of your apps are registered as games first, because that's going to allow you to take advantage of all the potential that's in the Snapdragon processor here. Now personally, I didn't use the game space for actual gaming or anything else like that. I actually just used it to tweak my settings, and then I just went back to the regular mode and then used it like that. It's a little bit disorienting at first, but luckily you only have to do this one time. So once you set an app as a game, you can leave it alone after that. Okay, now let's talk about fan noise. When you put it into performance mode, the fan's going to turn on no matter what, and this is what it's going to sound like. So yeah, I would say the fan noise is noticeable, but not loud. It's a little bit more high-pitched than I would have liked, but all the same, I don't really have any complaints about it. So moving over to gaming here, we're going to do a few stress tests on the Android side first. We'll start with Genshin Impact, and I set everything to the highest settings possible and then also turned it to 60 frames per second. And as you can see here, I've turned it onto gaming performance mode, so we're getting the best performance possible as well. In fact, I'm going to change the refresh rate from 60 Hz all the way to 165. I'm not really sure that makes a difference when the game is playing at 60 Hz, but let's do it anyway. And I'm also going to use an app called CPU Float, so you can see all of the clock speeds of the cores as we're playing. And of course, I'm probably going to cover it up with my thumbs half the time anyway. Either way, I do have a frame rate here on the top right, and it is getting a stable 60 frames per second even at the highest settings here. And so as you can imagine, if this game can play at full speed with the highest stats available, then everything else is going to play fine too. Let's do a quick test of audio quality. So yeah, it sounds pretty good. It does have stereo sound coming out of the earpiece as well as the bottom speaker. Now let's talk a little bit about these shoulder triggers up here on the top. And like I mentioned before, these can be key mapped using the built-in software here. This is one of the other reasons why you need to make sure that your games are registered as games in the GameSpace app. And there are a lot of different options you have within here. For example, you can change the touch sensitivity, and it can also be registered as different types of button presses, for example, a long press or multiple fast presses. But we're just going to keep it at the default settings here, and I'm going to use it for my attack and magic buttons. But yeah, it's as simple as just setting them and then just using these top buttons. And the settings are going to save on a per game basis. And the buttons themselves also give a haptic feedback. It's not the same as actually pressing a physical button, but it's not bad, it's pretty close. And at first I kind of figured it was a bit of a gimmick, like I didn't plan on using it, but it turns out that I liked it a lot. And so I do think if you want to just game on the go, like you don't want to have to worry about a controller or anything else like that, I consider these two buttons to be a nice added bonus to that experience. Now, like I mentioned before, this chip is notorious for running hot, and this phone is no exception. Even with a fan, you can feel the heat coming in from the airflow, and then the fan resting right above the CPU here does get super hot. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a thermal camera, but as you can see here, it gets well over 100 degrees just on the screen alone. And then on the back, after about 10 minutes of playing, I was getting between 106 and 107 degrees Fahrenheit. We also have one of those COVID forehead thermometers here, and unfortunately it doesn't really show a good readout here. It basically just says that the phone has COVID. But yeah, I would say if you're going to be playing games with your bare hands, I would just expect it to get pretty hot as you're playing. And I'll tell you, 106, 107 degrees on the back here is nothing to shake a stick at. It is pretty dang hot. I honestly would feel pretty uncomfortable playing this in the heat of the summer. Now that being said, when it comes to Android gaming, this is a pretty fun experience. And there are several games that do support 165 Hz frame rate. For example, Rail Racing 3, as you can see here, is running at 165 frames per second, and I'm using the internal gyroscope to control my car. It's kind of a fun experience, and it looks really nice. But if we're going to be honest, I can't tell a difference between 120 and 165 Hz. I mean, it's a pretty cool concept, but just to the bare eye, I can't tell a difference. And so games that run at 120 Hz, things like Asphalt 9 here, they look spectacular too. Like, all these games look really nice. And I would say if you plan on doing first-person shooter games, things like Call of Duty or PUBG, I think that these two shoulder buttons do give you a bit of a competitive edge. I was surprised at how natural it felt to play things like Call of Duty using those two shoulder triggers. It made it a much more enjoyable experience for me. And I'm sure there's other use cases, like MOBAs and things like that. I'm not really hip on all that stuff, but if you're into those kind of games, you might see the utility in that as well. But me personally, I prefer to use a controller, so we're going to use the GameSir X2 controller here. This thing costs between $60 and $70 depending on when it's on sale, and it just barely fits in this phone. But honestly, it looks pretty nice, like it has the exact same thickness of the controller itself, and so it kind of works as an impromptu gaming handheld. Now I did test out a couple other controllers, the Razer Kishi as well as the Bluetooth version of the X2. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the Bluetooth X2 because it has its own battery, which means you have to charge both this and the phone. Now, a lot of people do like the Razer Kishi, so let me show you what that setup looks like here on the phone. And like with the X2, it just barely fits. Now, unlike the X2, this one does have analog triggers, but unfortunately I find them to be of very poor quality, so I don't recommend using them at all. As much as I wish that there were other options out there, I do think the GameSir X2 is the best one available for Android right now. And of course, you could always use a Bluetooth controller as well. I'll have links to all this stuff in the video description. Now, when it comes to using the X2, I do recommend using games that have native controller support. You can use things like key mapping for games that only have touchscreen controls, but for the most part, I just focused on games that already had controller support. But yeah, for me, when you add a controller to a phone like this, it just feels like a more natural experience. And so for me, this is the way to go. If you're going to be gaming on a phone, I think you should use a controller too. And some of the games that have controller support also run at 165 Hz, as you can see with Dead Trigger 2 right here. But games that run at 120 Hz, they look nice too, like this one here. And to be honest, even if it just runs at 90 or 60 Hz, they still look pretty nice on the screen. But yeah, I think if you're into Android gaming, you're going to have a good time, especially if your favorite game uses something like Ultra HD graphics, and also has the ability to run at a high frame rate. This phone's going to be able to handle it, no problem. But of course, Android gaming is not really the focus of this channel. I'm into retro game emulation, so let's test that out now. Now we're going to jump right into Nintendo 64 and beyond. The classic stuff, things like Nintendo and Super Nintendo, they play just fine. And with the GameSir controller, you don't really have to worry about input lag. Of course, you can always use a run ahead of 1 when you're using RetroArch, but honestly, no complaints when it came to Android gaming for retro systems. So let's focus on Nintendo 64 and beyond. And of course, with Nintendo 64 here, no problems at all. In fact, I actually upscaled everything to 1440p just to make sure that everything was going to run smooth. And as you can see here, it runs like a dream. My only major complaint when it comes to retro gaming on a phone like this is the aspect ratio. 20:9 aspect ratio does give you very large black bars on each side when you're playing 4:3 content. But of course, that's not the fault of this phone or any other modern phone, that's just how they're made nowadays. And same thing here with Dreamcast, I also upscaled this to 1440p, and I also turned the auto frame skip off here on Redream, which is usually on by default. And as you can see, even the hardest to play games, things like NBA 2K2, is running super smooth at 1440p, no problems at all. Moving over to PSP, these games look excellent. Part of that is the fact that they run in a native 16:9 aspect ratio. And for the most part, I played all these games at a 4x resolution, so 1080p to match the screen of the phone itself. But just for fun, I did test how high the resolution could go before I saw slowdown, and for the most part, I could play everything at a 10x resolution and have no problem. Now, the harder to play games, things like Ghost of Sparta, you do need to drop it down to something like 8x resolution instead, but given the fact that this screen is not capable of showing a resolution higher than 4x, it was really just kind of a test of performance. I think that if you just set everything to a 4x resolution so it's a 1080p signal, you're going to have absolutely zero issue with any PSP game that you can throw at it. So let's move it up a generation and start out with the Nintendo GameCube. Now on this one, I'm playing everything at a 3x resolution, so a 1080p signal. And I'm happy to say that almost every single game ran fine as well. Now here I'm using the latest development build from the Dolphin website. I just downloaded it directly onto my phone. And other than setting it at a 3x resolution, I didn't do any other tweaks. Some games will require you to switch between OpenGL and Vulkan, and every once in a while you will find a game that doesn't run very well, like this one here. But these games are going to be very few and far between. I think I only found maybe 2 of them altogether. One bummer here is that Rogue Squadron seemed to crash every time I started up a game. I'm not really sure what's up with that. Maybe there's some settings I can change to make it a little bit better, but unfortunately this one did have issues. But like I said, most GameCube games, absolutely zero problem at all. These issues were very few and far between. Okay, we've been at it for a while and Chicken just jumped on my lap, so let's do a quick cat break. For those of you who are new to the channel, this is my cat Chicken here. She is 14 years old and she loves hanging out on my lap while I'm testing games. Anyway, yeah, Chicken says hello and everyone else says hello back. Let's get back to the gaming. So like I said before, GameCube runs really well on this. There are going to be some games that have issues, and I don't want to say that every game runs perfectly, but I would say at least 95% of the games had no problem at all. So if you really want to play GameCube on this device, I think you're going to have no problem. And a lot of these games running at a 1080p resolution look really nice too, so this is going to be a nice experience. Moving up a little bit more, here is the Nintendo Wii using the exact same Dolphin emulator, and these also run like a dream. Like with GameCube, I did have to switch between OpenGL and Vulkan, and I would say for the most part, OpenGL seems to work the best, but every once in a while you're going to find a game that's going to do better with Vulkan instead. You're still going to get a little bit of slowdown with games like Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, especially when you're doing like a big special move, but regardless, I would say that Wii is completely playable on this device too. Now surprisingly, 3DS is actually hit and miss. And this is using just the regular Citra emulator here, but I was getting a couple weird issues. For example, Link's arms are like really rubbery looking, that was kind of odd. And these games are running at a 3x resolution, which I think is a 720p for this display. And you know, other games like Mario Kart 7, they seem to run pretty well. You would get some slowdown here and there, but I would say this is completely playable. But other games like this one didn't play well at all. In fact, I was getting about 15% speed. And so it is going to vary by game, so I would say don't buy this phone if you specifically want to play 3DS games on the go. As it stands right now, a 3DS is still probably your best way to play 3DS games. So to be conservative here, I would say maybe 3/4 of 3DS games seem to play at full speed, and then randomly other games are going to have graphical issues or slowdown. Now I also did some temperature tests while having the phone in the controller to see if that impeded airflow. And it does seem that the phone gets quite a bit hotter when you are playing it in the controller. As you can see, about 105 degrees on the screen and up to 117 degrees on the back. Now thankfully, when you're using a game controller like this, you're not going to actually feel the heat, and that's a really nice thing. But a phone getting up to 117 degrees Fahrenheit is a little bit worrying. I don't know enough about thermals to know whether or not this is going to be a bad thing over extended use, but I do think it's a factor worth mentioning. Okay, and the last system I'm going to show off here is PS2 emulation, and luckily PS2 runs really well on this device. I'm using the Ether SX2 emulator here and doing a 3x resolution, so 1080p signal here as well. And I'm alternating between the Vulkan and OpenGL backend depending on the game. And for the most part, I didn't have to do any other settings tweaks unless there was some specific graphical issue that I could fix using hacks in the settings themselves. But other than that, most of the games played at 1080p. A few of them did need to be bumped down to 720p, things like God of War 2 for example, played best at 720p. And others like Burnout Revenge as well as Champions of Norrath, they actually had to be played at a native resolution. But like with GameCube, those were very few and far between. For the most part, this is a set and forget kind of experience. You set it to 1080p, and then yeah, maybe alternate between Vulkan and OpenGL to see which one works best. And then just kind of have fun after that. There's no other settings tweaks that you need to do. A lot of games that seem to emulate really poorly on other phones, things like NBA Live 2005 or Madden 2005, played at full speed without any sort of extra configuration. And I do think that other Snapdragon phones are able to play PS2 no problem. But I think the distinction with this phone here is that it can be played using the safe preset at a 3x resolution with no slowdown and not having to do any sort of other settings tweaks. And so I think when it comes to quote-unquote pick up and play PS2 gameplay, besides using a PC with a dedicated graphics card, this is the best performance I've seen to date. And so I think this is the major distinguishing factor of this phone. If you're a huge PS2 fan and you want to play everything in a nice 1080p resolution, this phone here with a telescopic controller might be your best option. Now one last thing I do want to show off here is the phone is capable of video out. So you'll want to use a USB-C to HDMI adapter like this, or you could hook the phone up to a full-on USB-C hub and you could just connect everything to it. And this was a plug-and-play experience. I didn't have to do anything else other than just plug it into my TV. And I think when it comes to Android games, it does look pretty good. There's no lag or anything else like that. But unfortunately, it does scale it to a 20:9 aspect ratio in your display, which I think is fine when it comes to Android games. It gives it a bit of a cinematic look here with black bars at the top and the bottom. But unfortunately, when you try to play something like a 16:9 system, things like PSP, not only is it going to maintain those black bars at the top and bottom, but it's going to give you black bars on the left and right as well. And unfortunately, I couldn't find any settings that would enable me to play 16:9 content natively. And so yeah, I find it to be kind of weird to play 16:9 games like this with this black frame around the entire display. And I'd love it if the company fixed this in a future firmware update, but I'm not really holding my breath. So unfortunately, if you wanted to use this phone as like a plug-in home console, the experience is going to be a little bit compromised. Alright, we've been at this for a while. Let's go ahead and start summarizing things here. We'll start with what I like and what I don't like about this phone. Number one, no bones about it, I like the fact that it has a powerful chipset. I found that this phone will make some games that are usually a struggle on other phones to be completely playable and easy. And so the ease of use of this can't be overstated. I also think it has a nice display, the colors are good, the contrast is nice as well, and 165Hz refresh rate just feels super awesome in the hands. I was surprised to find that I also like those shoulder triggers. Battery life is great, I have no complaints about it. It functions as a regular old phone in your everyday use, and I think if you're going to use really intense gaming, you can get about 4 hours and maybe a little bit more out of the battery. On top of that, the fast charging is super good, like I could charge from 0 to 100 in about an hour. And I love the little creature comforts of this phone, the fact that it doesn't have a camera notch and it also has a headphone jack. These are nice little touches that a lot of other companies have left behind. Now let's talk about the things I don't like about the REDMAGIC 7. And I think first and foremost is the fact that this phone gets really hot. I think that anything over 100 degrees is not very fun to hold in the hands. And I appreciate that they used active cooling here because I wonder what it would be like without that fan. Now unfortunately, the phone does not have a microSD card slot, which I think is a big miss. The thing is, if you have a high-end phone that's focused on gaming, that means you're going to be playing high-end games. And for the most part, these high-end games require a lot of storage space. Now 256 gigs is a pretty hefty amount of storage space on a phone, but I think it is a missed opportunity to not have the ability to use external storage in a microSD card, because then you could put hundreds of PS2 and GameCube games on the phone. As it stands right now, you are going to be pretty limited on what you can store. I also think that the integration of the game space function is a little bit odd. I personally would have preferred to have it as a standalone app that you can just go into and then label all of your games and emulators as games themselves to unlock all of that high performance mode. The fact that they used an actual physical button toggle on here just seems a little bit distracting to me. And while I do like the fact that it has kind of a transparent look to it, I'm not a huge fan of the gamery design of the back of the phone. I think if they had kept it super clean and sleek, it would have just looked a lot better. And finally, I'm a little bit worried about the life cycle of that internal fan on the phone. Given the fact that it's a moving part and it runs at 20,000 RPM, I worry that over a course of a year or two, it's going to get worn out or maybe get full of dust, things like that. It's an additional factor that you have to consider that you usually don't have to think about with other phones. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's what I like and what I don't like about the REDMAGIC 7. I think the display and the performance on it are second to none, and I'm really interested to see how other competitors do in terms of performance without using a fan like this. And so, in a nutshell, do I recommend the REDMAGIC 7 to somebody looking to buy a new phone? And as always, I am going to say that it does depend on you. If you're looking to upgrade your phone, and maybe you're also considering buying a used phone that you can use for gaming, then I think this phone can knock out both uses at once. Not only can it do phone things rather well, but it obviously can do all the gaming stuff better than anything else on the market today. And so if something like emulating PS2 is really important to you, or if you're a big fan of like competitive gaming on Android, as it stands right now, I don't know of any other phone that's going to be better than this one. And I do think that REDMAGIC was pretty thoughtful in some of the software features that they have available and just the different widgets and things like that to keep you in a sort of gaming frame of mind. But if you're more interested in a flagship phone experience and maybe just a little bit of gaming, then I think maybe a used phone from the previous generation, or potentially a non-gaming phone that has more features for everyday use, that might be more interesting for you. Either way, I really enjoyed the past couple weeks that I've spent with the REDMAGIC 7, and I think it's pretty neat to see what the best phone out there can do in terms of emulation. Anyway, that's about it for this video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Is this a phone worth getting, or are there better options out there? As always, thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.